The three key stages to the War of Armageddon. We have seen in the video the three stages of the frog-like spirits before Armageddon. Now we are going to attempt to demonstrate the three key stages of the 40 Years' War of Armageddon. In effect, there are three separate conflicts centered in Israel or Jerusalem. The three conflicts are separated by short periods of time, but they are three stages of the same war, the judgment of the world. Stage 1 is a war with Israel's nearby neighbours, the very people mentioned in Psalm 83. Following Israel's victory, there is a temporary time of peace. Stage 2 is a war with Israel's wider enemies, including Russia, Iran and Turkey. See Ezekiel chapter 38. Stages 1 and 2 must happen within a 10-year period. Stage 3 is a war, which is a religious war and is centered on Jerusalem. This war is with Rome and Europe. This lasts 30 years. In Zechariah chapter 12 and chapter 14, in the past, we may have seen these two chapters as simply the same war told twice, but what if Zechariah chapter 12 was stage 1 of the conflict and Zechariah chapter 14 was stage 2? What if Zechariah chapter 12 involved Israel's nearby neighbours and Zechariah chapter 14 involved totally different nations, the outer ring of nations of Russia, Iran and Turkey, etc.? Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 2 says, I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink that makes the nearby nations stagger when they send their armies to Jerusalem and Judah. This description is surely talking about people living in Syria, Jordan and Lebanon, Israel's nearby nations, nearby neighbours. The nearby neighbours send their armies. We cannot call Russia, Iran and Turkey nearby nations. But the destruction of Israel's nearby nations or nearby neighbours is not the final victory. In fact, Israel is greatly weakened at this point despite a peace deal, and the sense of security an encompassing void has opened up in the Middle East. Into this vacuum pours Russia and Iran. This is the second stage. It is detailed in Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 3. Moreover, on that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy burden for all the nations, and all who try to carry it will be seriously injured, yet all the peoples of the earth will be assembled against it. This verse sounds more encompassing, but this is speaking of the broader second stage of the conflict. It is saying that Jerusalem will become a heavy burden for the world, and it does of course eventually become this. Please note that there is no specific mention of all the neighbouring nations or people in Zechariah chapter 14. It begins with verse 2, which says, all nations are gathered against Jerusalem. We also note that verse 1 gives the reason for the invasion. Thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. Why are we told that the nations have come to take a spoil? This is surely a reference to Ezekiel chapter 38 verses 11 and 12. I will take a spoil and will take a prey. Whereas in Zechariah chapter 12 Jerusalem survives the onslaught. In chapter 14 it most certainly does not. We read in verse 2, the city will be taken, the houses looted and the women raped, Half the population will be taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. Jerusalem is in ruins. The city has fallen to the invading Russian army. This is a total different war to chapter 12, where Jerusalem does not fall. Finally, Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 5 says, there is a great earthquake. We have a great earthquake in Zechariah chapter 14. This surely also links to the great earthquake of Ezekiel chapter 38, when Russia is destroyed. And then, when this second stage of the judgment is complete, Christ is established as king in Jerusalem. See Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 9. There is of course one last conflict. Stage 1 was a war with Israel's nearby neighbours, or nearby nations. They have been dealt with in Zechariah chapter 12. Their motive was revenge for Israel living in what they thought was their land. Then Israel's wider enemies have been dealt with in Zechariah chapter 14. Their motive was taking a spoil, riches, greed, covetousness. This is speaking of the nations in Ezekiel chapter 38. But there is a final war, a religious war. This war is led by the papacy against Christ and the saints. We note there is no mention of our religious aspect to the war of Zechariah chapter 14. It is about spoil. The final war is recorded in Revelation chapter 17. Rome joins with Europe, attacks Christ and the saints when they are established in Jerusalem. The false prophet and the beast are destroyed, never to appear again. The kingdom is now at peace. The world is now subdued under the rulership of Christ, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and his saints.